Now for chapter 2. After these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus was appeased, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what was decreed against her. Now it is important right off the bat to understand about what time period that this is in the reign of King Xerxes. These events must belong in this chapter. These events must belong to the time between the great assembly held at Susa in Xerxes' third year and the departure of the monarch on his expedition against Greece in his fifth year, whenever he went to war against the Spartans and all of these. That's important to understand because of the long intervals given within this chapter. Then said the king's servants, once that he remembered what he had done to Vashti and so forth, and it has a feeling of regret. Then said the king's servants that ministered unto him, Let there be fair young virgins sought for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather together all the fair young virgins unto Shushan the palace, to the house of the women, unto the custody of Hegi, the king's chamberlain, keeper of the women, and let their things for purification be given them. I agree with Charles Ellicott on this. The whole verse shows as conclusively as anything could do and how degrading an aspect Eastern women were as a whole viewed. Verse 4, And let the maiden which pleaseth the king be queen instead of Vashti, and the thing pleased the king, and he did so. Now in Shushan the palace there was a certain Jew, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captivity which had been carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar the king of Babylon had carried away. And the great importance there in mentioning Jeconiah the king is that belongs to the second captivity. There were 3 Babylonian captivities that occurred. In the first siege of 605 BC, Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, all of those were taken. But Israel was left, but they lost their sovereignty as a nation. They had to pay tribute then to Nebuchadnezzar. Then a second siege occurred about 8 years later in 597 BC, and that's whenever Ezekiel and Mordecai's great-grandfather, Kish, was taken, and that's who it's referring to with this second Jeconiah captivity. Now, another key factor to remember is that those first 2 captivities, Nebuchadnezzar was taking the most talented of the Jews back to Babylon in order to assist him in his government there, like Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and all of them. So Mordecai, how this trickled down to him, as we'll learn right here in a second, is that Mordecai was probably part of the gatekeepers at the very least within the kingdom. And once again, that's very important to remember throughout this story. How he winds up in this place without being reprimanded and all of this. He had access to it. Verse 7, And he brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, Esther being her Persian name. His uncle's daughter, which would make Esther his cousin. So he's not much older, probably, than Esther. He's probably around 10, 15 years older or so, but he's not really a very old man because it's figured that Esther is only about 20 years old right here. So Mordecai's probably in his mid-30s or so, I would say. Maybe 40, maybe. But his uncle's daughter, and he's kind of like her adoptive father. For she had neither father nor mother, and the maid was fair and beautiful, whom Mordecai, when her father and mother were dead, took for his own daughter. So it came to pass, when the king's commandment and his decree was heard, and when many maidens were gathered together unto Shushan the palace to the custody of Hegi, that Esther was brought also unto the king's house to the custody of Hegi, keeper of the women. And the maiden pleased him, and she obtained kindness of him. And he speedily gave her her things for purification, with such things as belonged to her, and 7 maidens, which were meet to be given her out of the king's house. And he preferred her and her maids unto the best place of the house of the women. And right here we see a type of Joseph, and how God, we can already see God working in all of this. How Joseph, he was just favored right away by the higher-ups. And Esther, the very same thing is happening. Esther had not showed her people nor her kindred, for Mordecai had charged her that she should not show it, meaning she didn't tell anyone that she was a Jew. And Mordecai walked every day before the court of the women's house to know how Esther did and what should become of her. Right over here is the women's quarters. He walked right along that side. And just to clarify, Joseph Benson wrote this: Mordecai might walk there without being suspected because he belonged to the court and was a man of some rank, for those that were carried away in Jeconiah's captivity, as his ancestors were of the better sort. Now when every maid's turn was come to go in to King Ahasuerus, after that she had been 12 months, according to the manner of the women, for so were the days of their purifications accomplished, to wit, 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with sweet odors, and with other things for the purifying of the women. So many of you may be thinking, a year's worth of purification? Well, there's several reasons for this. These women were kept so long, partly for their better purification, as it here follows, partly out of state, as that which became so great a king, and partly that, being so long in safe custody, the king might be sure he was not imposed upon by a child begotten by another man. We're talking about successors to the throne here. Verse 13, Then thus came every maiden unto the king. Whatsoever she desired was given her to go with her out of the house of the women unto the king's house. In the evening she went, and on the morrow she returned into the second house of the women to the custody of Shazgaz, the king's chamberlain, which kept the concubines. She came in unto the king no more, except the king delighted in her, and that she were called by name. Now when the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her for his daughter, was come to go in unto the king, she required nothing but what Hegai, the king's chamberlain, the keeper of the women, appointed. And Esther obtained favor in the sight of all them that looked upon her. So Esther was taken into King Ahasuerus into his house royal in the 10th month, which is the month Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. Now we know that in the 3rd year, he got rid of Vashti. So what's the deal with this 4-year period? Pulpit commented at this point, 4 years after the disgrace of Vashti, probably in January 479 BC, Xerxes had recently returned from the Grecian expedition, defeated and disgraced. He was glad to dismiss warlike matters from his thoughts.
The son of Darius, Xerxes I, was then able to move forward with a new invasion in 480 BC. Achaemenid forces gathered in Sardis and crossed Hellespont in April. The invading army continued towards the Macedonian border with a large navy flanking it. Initially, the Greek plan was to defend in the Vale of Tempe, but that would have left most of the mainland undefended against the amphibious invasion. Instead, the land forces of the Greek cities, consisting of 5,000 to 10,000 troops, led by Spartan king Leonidas, blocked off the pass of Thermopylae. To the east, a 300 trireme-strong allied navy under Athenian command closed off the straits of Artemisium. Persian forces arrived in the area by late August. Their army had around 200,000 warriors, while the navy consisted of 1,000 or so triremes. Before the Persian fleet reached the Greeks, a storm broke out, and almost a third of their ships perished. The Persians attempted to send a portion of their navy to the south to circle around Euboea and surround Hellenes. However, one more storm sunk these vessels. The first 2 days of the land battle in Thermopylae were going according to the plan of Leonidas, but by the 3rd day, the Persians outflanked his troops. Xerxes watched the battle from his throne sat on a nearby mountain, but couldn't do anything to change the course of this engagement. The Persians lost around 300 ships, and although they still had a few hundred more, the invasion was in disarray. Xerxes retreated to Asia to avoid being trapped in Europe. He left a land army to fight on, but it was defeated in 479 BC during the Battle of Plataea. At the same time, the Persian navy was defeated yet again at Mycala in Ionia. Xerxes and his descendants did not attempt to conquer Greece again.
So now we have better insight into what Esther is actually dealing with. This very mercurial king right here. He's quite different from chapter 1, where he's boasting about all of his greatness and all, and now he is just, you talk about a shattered ego. So yeah, Esther, she's got a lot on her plate, to say the very least. Verse 16, so Esther was taken unto King Ahasuerus into his house royal in the 10th month. Verse 17, and the king loved Esther above all the women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king made a great feast unto all his princes and his servants, even Esther's feast. And he made a release to the provinces and gave gifts according to the state of the king. Okay, so now Esther, she has been crowned queen. And then we come to this verse. And when the virgins were gathered together the second time, then Mordecai sat in the king's gate. So he's gathering together more women to spend the night with. And I know of no woman that could possibly tolerate such a thing. And some of the commentators picked up on this. Charles Ellicott noted, the king loved Esther above all the women, but how the word love is degraded in this connection is seen by the fact that after she had been his wife certainly less, possibly much less than 5 years, there takes place a second gathering of virgins. Verse 20, Esther had not yet showed her kindred nor her people, as Mordecai had charged her, for Esther did the commandment of Mordecai, like as when she was brought up with him. In those days, while Mordecai sat in the king's gate, 2 of the king's chamberlains, Bigthan and Teresh, of those which kept the door, were wroth, and sought to lay hand on the king Ahasuerus, and they're planning an assassination attempt against Xerxes. And the thing was known to Mordecai, who told it unto Esther the queen, and Esther certified the king thereof in Mordecai's name. And when inquisition was made of the matter, it was found out. Therefore, they were both hanged on a tree, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles before the king. Now, whenever it says this, because this is going to get brought up later with Haman, about this hanging on a tree, the Persians were pretty much the very first or among the first to practice crucifixion. So this was either being impaled on a stake or crucifixion.